Okay, welcome to Coffee with Kyle, our podcast discussing issues of business and economics. I'm Kyle Murray, Dean of the Lazaridis School of Business and Economics. This is a special edition of our podcast. We're focused on something everyone's talking about right now, which is tariffs. So today is March 6th. It's been a bit of a whipsaw couple of days in geopolitics and economics. 2 days ago, President Trump imposed tariffs of 25% on Canada and Mexico, as well as some tariffs on China. Canada retaliated with tariffs of its own. Yesterday, the US pulled back on some tariffs in the auto industry. And then just moments ago, have paused tariffs on some Mexican goods. So, to say the least, things are a little chaotic right now. But we're lucky we have someone here to help us better understand where we're at and maybe where things are going. So I'm joined by Professor Asim Masaji, who's an associate professor in the school, Lazaridis School. He has a degree in law from the University of Toronto and a PhD in economics also from the U of T. His research areas include international trade, development, law, and economics. Okay, Azim, so we have a lot to cover. I've got my coffee. Let's pour into it. I want to start with some simple things.
Sure.
Uh, my take on tariffs up until a few weeks ago is that that was the class, that was the part of the class, if we took the class, it was the part of the class we didn't pay a lot of attention to. Tariffs sort of seemed like a historical thing. And now all of a sudden they're front and center. So maybe just walk through a few of the basics, get everybody on the same page. So in simple terms, what are tariffs?
Well, a tariff is a tax, and it's a tax that applies to goods that enter your boundaries. Tariffs have existed probably as long as we've had governments. And primarily because they're an easy way for governments to raise revenue. So it's easy to keep control, or easier anyway, to keep control of your borders, and to monitor the goods and services, or well, especially the goods that are coming in. And so the simplest form of tariffs probably would be something like, for every tomato that comes in, we're going to put in you're going to pay 10 cents to the government. That's the simplest kind of tariff. That's called what we economists like to call a specific tariff. It's a particular amount of money associated with one unit of the good. Those are increasingly less and less common. We tend to use tariffs, which are known as ad valorem tariffs. And all that means is that a tariff is charged as a percentage of the value at which of the good as it leaves the factory gate. So when Trump talks about 25% tariffs, he's putting 25% tariffs. That's on the price at which, the price at which the good left the factory gate. So that's basically what a tariff is in a nutshell. So not too difficult to understand.
Okay, so we have in the Waterloo region quite a bit of manufacturing.
Yes.
I know one of our grads, many of our grads actually work in different areas of manufacturing. So if we take a simple example of a meat processing plant selling some of its meat to the US, so we're selling some steaks or some pork or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Essentially, what you're saying is if I say that that steak is worth $10 as it leaves the plant, and the US adding a 25% tariff to that $10. So
That's
now
right.
it's arriving at $12.50.
And 50 cents exactly. That's exactly right. And $2.50 goes to the US Treasury for that.
Right. And so then if someone in the US buys that steak, they're going to pay a higher price than they would have prior to the tariff.
That's exactly right. Now, there's some question about this, and President Trump insists that this is going to be paid by the country that's exporting. And he's not entirely wrong. And I'll put it this way: he's mostly wrong, but he's not entirely wrong. If Canada imposes tariffs on goods, it's almost guaranteed, except in a few classes of goods where Canada has real market power, that Canadian consumers have real market power, that we don't affect the world price of the goods, right? We're not going to affect how people are going to price goods. So if Canada imposes tariffs, almost all the tariffs are paid by the final consumer. The United States is large enough, it's a large enough market that the fact that people are being cut out of this very large market may influence price reductions on this side of the border, right? Which means that some of that tariff is being absorbed by the producer at this end.
Right.
And that's why he's not entirely wrong that the tariff is. Now, the evidence on
And just
this, when you,
as a quick example on that, then what you're saying is if I'm sending that steak to the US with the tariff, it should be 12.50, but maybe I'm only going to charge 11.50 and absorb some of that on my
that's
end.
exactly right.
Okay.
That's exactly right. And the reason why that might occur with the United States is because the United States is a really large market. You don't want to lose access to the market. You can't afford to lose access to that market. So the United States, economists refer to this as they can influence the terms of trade, basically. That's the fancy term. You might hear it used. That is that is that is essentially how some of that cost gets borne by the exporting nation. Now, I will say this, the evidence on the Trump tariffs that were imposed in his first administration, particularly on China, suggests that most of the cost was passed on to the US consumer. Now, whether that has to do with, I mean, the United States is a very big customer for China, but it does appear that on the goods that were taxed, the Chinese exporters passed those costs on to US consumers. So I think there are serious limits to the extent to which exporters will bear those costs, even if you are dealing with the United States, which is a huge market.
Right. So to some extent, I think what you're saying is, as researchers, we all say it's kind of an empirical question. It's we're waiting to see how it's actually going to play out. Uh,
Yeah,
but but Canadian exporters will probably eat some of the cost to keep some of the market, but
yeah.
probably not all of the cost. So some will get passed on.
Well, it depends. I think some of it will get eaten. I mean, if you think about a market like aluminum, which is, it's one of Quebec's largest exports, um, really there is a global market for aluminum, and Quebecers will be able to sell aluminum to the rest of the world if they don't sell it to Canada. The last time there were aluminum tariffs on that placed on Canada, our sales of aluminum in the United States did go down. In general, though, Quebec aluminum found new markets. That being said, there was a reason why we were supplying the United States. Aluminum is not, it costs money to ship aluminum, right? It's a light metal, but it's still a metal. And some of that cost of the extra shipping was borne by the exporters, right, in reaching markets. So they did absorb some of the cost of that tariff.
Yeah, so we're already getting into some of the details, but it's really interesting stuff. I mean, essentially, what we're talking about is this impact on prices, whether you're now shipping it somewhere else or just the tariffs as it crosses the border, is part of the reason why economists often suspect tariffs have an impact on economic growth, right? Because we're creating a drag here, an inefficiency that otherwise wouldn't be there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, tariffs have their uses. Okay, so it's not. I would say that I think there's one view prevailing view in economics that tariffs are always bad, and I'm sort of the view that tariffs are mostly always bad. And I'll say there are times when tariffs can be incredibly useful and actually economically beneficial. So one situation is when you're developing an infant industry, and particularly this is the case for developing countries who are credit constrained, right? Where banks aren't necessarily there or able to finance projects with an uncertain horizon. In those situations, tariffs can provide protection for the local industries to develop. I say can, it doesn't always happen. There's all kinds of political factors that figure in the assignment of those tariffs. But in situations, it has worked. And in particular, it worked in Canada, I would say. Uh, there's, I think, a debate in Canada as to whether the tariffs that were imposed at the later part of the 19th century as part of the national policy were good for Canada in a global sense. But I think there's very little debate among economists about whether it helped grow our industrial sector in Ontario and Quebec. I think without those tariffs, that farm machinery sector in particular, which was the first sort of industrial foray for southern Ontario, would not have developed. And it's, I think, based on that a lot of the ancillary industries and the successor manufacturing industries that we see today are here. And there are other times, I think, in the question of environmental protection, there are situations where tariffs at our borders may be justified to prevent what we call leakage, carbon leakage, or any other kind of leakage, which is basically firms lowering environmental enforcement in other parts of the world and taking advantage of the fact, taking advantage of the facts of lax enforcement in another part of the world. Um, in those situations, you can, it could be, there's an argument that this is welfare improving.
Yeah, I
But yeah, in
so
general, it's
yeah.
going to be inefficient, right? You're protecting a producer in your local market who's producing at a higher cost. They need that tariff in order to survive against import competition. So what you're doing is sourcing from a higher cost producer.
Right. Right. So I think that's probably the way most people, their intuition about tariffs would be is that, most of the time we want free trade, but there's definitely times where barriers to free trade, and tariffs could be one of those, are going to make sense. And maybe even more so for a smaller country, like you said, or developing country or whatever it might be. Okay, so I think you did a good job of explaining some of the benefits of tariffs and where we might use them. Now, the harder question, the one that I've been struggling with is why is the US doing this? What are their goals? And I know I'm asking you to speculate a little. You're obviously not in the president's office, but if you were to take a guess, what do you think's going on this time around?
It's not clear to me. I mean, we know that there are constituencies in the United States that have been hurt, particularly by increased competition from China. And let's be clear about that. I think there was some impact of NAFTA, and I wouldn't want to trivialize that, particularly in certain sectors like textiles and manufacturing in general. Um, there has been a big impact of the increase in trade in China. And there are communities which have been particularly hard hit. Are Americans generally better off but as a result of increased trade in China? Absolutely. So the gains have fallen. I mean, taking a generous view of this, so one of the arguments would be that he wants to bring back manufacturing, or he wants to allow production in places which have been hollowed out, where manufacturing has been hollowed out. There's a lot of political pressure to do so. Um, I think there's I think that may be it. I'm not sure that's a realistic goal. All the evidence on previous tariffs suggests that, it doesn't do as much. The last round of tariffs didn't do as much to stem the tide of the jobs leaving. There's a classic case study of washing machines and washing machine production in the United States as opposed to Mexico and China. And it really didn't do very much to boost the washing machine industry in the United States. Just to give a concrete example of that. I think
So
there's another
why?
aspect of this that we're overlooking. I think that one of the issues is, and he's repeatedly said this, is that he wants to use them as a source of revenue. And we haven't used tariffs as a primary source of revenue for a very long time, right? We're talking probably over 100 years. And that's I think a much more pernicious argument, because what he would like to do, I think, is to lower taxes uh, on the conventional way, whether it's income taxes or taxes on capital or taxes on whatever, and have tariffs replace them. Now, the thing that we need to keep in mind is that tariffs are paid by consumers. They're almost certainly a highly regressive, which means that the incidence of tariffs falls more heavily on poorer people than richer people.
Right. Right.
So
Right.
they're a bad tax. They're a bad way to tax to raise revenue.
Which I guess, hypothetical situation, you're a billionaire, all your friends are billionaires. Maybe a regressive tax is not the end of the world for you. But okay,
Yeah.
so I mean, this is fascinating, and it's something I wonder about too. I mean, I'm a more of a behavioral guy. I'm trying to understand, what's not only are we putting these tariffs on, but then we take, the U.S. takes them off and then puts them on again, then takes them off. So it also seems like there's some kind of maybe what economists would call signaling, or sort of a power dynamic here of just flexing on other countries. Some have suggested maybe as a way to begin negotiations for the next round of NAFTA, but it's really hard to understand because, from a behavioral perspective, what you're most likely to do is sort of harden attitudes against you by treating even an enemy, but definitely a friend this way.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely seems to be a play for attention, right? Like he's in the news. He's got people dancing around trying to figure out what exactly he wants. And I mean, I think it's safe to say, business people, economists, everybody agree that uncertainty is bad. Not only is the fact of the tariff bad, but the uncertainty has been, even prior to any tariffs being imposed, has put a drag on economic growth. So I was looking just yesterday, partly in preparation for this, and the revisions to gross domestic product growth uh, projections for 2025, and we had a relatively good the prognosis in say in September from the Bank of Canada was that 2025 would be a relatively good year for Canada. Growth would be north of 2% of real GDP. And those were revised downwards by probably close to half a percentage point, simply on the fact of economic uncertainty. And if the tariffs do come and do stick, that's going to create that's going to create a much bigger drag on growth, obviously. But that uncertainty, which prevents people from making investment decisions, frankly, also makes consumer decisions harder. If you're trying to buy something big, maybe, do I buy now? Do I buy later? Do I wait until do I wait for the 4 months that I was planning to? That kind of uncertainty is not helpful at all for economic growth. And I mean, I can't imagine, right? Like you and I are both in jobs which are relatively recession proof. I won't say completely, but we are relatively recession proof. Our jobs may become harder to do because we'll have less resources, but that's not us. But for people who are in these sectors, right, how does that influence their consumption behavior, right? I mean, maybe you make the car last a little longer, right? Like all of those things are weighing on people's minds.
Yeah, as well as savings and investment decisions, all these
Absolutely. Do you
are
choose to retire?
right, right. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't choose to retire right away, right? I mean, we really don't know what the next little while looks like. Okay. So some people have talked about a trade war, which sounds like fairly strong language. And I know this is an area you have some expertise in. So give us a little history on, what does it mean to be in a trade war? Is that the
So,
right term for this?
so I mean, trade wars have been more limited in the recent past, right? They've involved I mean, our disputes with the United States, it's not like we haven't had disputes. We had one of the longest running trade disputes that I know of, and I mean, it's not dead, softwood lumber, right? Where the United States was claiming that we were dumping softwood lumber in their markets and imposed tariffs, and we really weren't. But and that has led to retaliatory tariffs on the part of Canada, retaliatory actions. Things cool down, then they flare up again. So that's been an ongoing kind of thing. So it's been very limited to particular goods. And that's how a lot of these things have taken place with respect to most trade disputes. We're going to have disputes, we're going to have claims that people are dumping, that foreign producers are dumping goods in our market, undercutting our domestic producers, that they're somehow engaged in some sort of unfair competition. Those have been the nature of most trade disputes over the last 50, 70 years, maybe, possibly even longer, as in the multilateral system that we've had, and also within the trade pacts that we have increasingly formulated across the world, right? Not just Canada, but other nations as well. The last time I was trying to search back. The last time we had a trade dispute of this magnitude, we have to go back to 1930, and that is the imposition of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in the United States, which were, a bit larger than what is being contemplated now, but certainly in the same order of magnitude. And those were imposed in 1930 and there was a broad consensus in the United States around the imposition of those imports, and increasingly isolationist stance. It was something that was sponsored by Democrats and Republicans. and signed by the president at the time, Herbert Hoover. Um, in anticipation of that, Canada imposed, and in fact, in anticipation of the enactment of those tariffs, Canada actually imposed tariffs in the United States, and those remained for a while. Canada and one of the responses to that in that day and age was that Canada and other empire nations, as they were known at that time, tried to divert trade within the empire, and there was a series of accords, in fact, signed in Ottawa to try and free up trade within what was then the British Empire. So between Australia and the United Kingdom, it's really about access to the United Kingdom market, which is the largest market at the time. That was the last time. The lesson from that was that ultimately that proved to be relatively unsuccessful. I mean, Canada wasn't particularly committed to opening up its markets, and neither were some of the other Commonwealth nations. The Brits were a little bit more open, and Canada's exports to Britain did increase. But imports still primarily came from the United States, despite the fact that there was a big tariff, and that didn't change very much over that period. And by the mid 1930s, Ottawa's policy had changed to trying again to restore preferential access to the United States through reciprocity agreements. So that's the last time we've engaged in a full-scale trade war in Canada, really, of the kind of magnitude that we're undergoing right now.
Yeah, and I mean, at the time, the economic background was quite different, right? We're talking about the 19.
Very different, right? I mean, we are in a different position now. Uh, Obviously, we were in the midst of the Great Depression, and
Right.
the tariffs were really one way of trying to perhaps address that. It was a wrong-headed way, but it was one way of doing that. But we were also, I mean, we live in a world which is much more integrated now than the world of 1930. And we have, I think, outside of the United States, we still have a broad commitment internationally to freer trade. And as Canada, I mean, Canada has, free trade agreements with a number of different countries. I will say, though, we are more dependent for our exports now than we were in 1930 on the United States, right? We currently send about close to 75% of our goods go to the United States. At the time, it was somewhere between 40, somewhere in the 40s. And as a percentage of GDP, we trade more today than we did then. So in some ways, we are much more vulnerable, but there are perhaps more outlets. And the other being is that unemployment is relatively low, and Canada is economically in fairly good shape, despite lots of problems. That doesn't take away from that, but basically the economy is pretty sound.
Right. Right. Yeah. So I mean, that's kind of the good news is we're in a relatively good position coming into this situation. And as you're saying, we're reliant on exporting more of our goods, but partly that's because we've negotiated these trade pacts like NAFTA and USMCA and others, which gave us the confidence that we could change our economy to rely on this kind of trade. Okay, so I think that was a great sort of short course in tariffs, and get everybody up to speed. Now, the harder question is always for economists predicting the future, or anybody, not just economists. But how do Canadians react? As you said, some people are probably worried. Should I save money? Where should I save it? Should I, hold my car longer? Should I delay retirement? Like, how do we start to think about these decisions just as Canadians and, our daily consumption type behaviors?
Yeah. So that's a great question, I mean, I think it's $1 million question. I think the one thing we have to be careful. I think one thing we have to keep in mind is that a lot of these impacts are going to be a bit longer term. So we're locked into production patterns, and it's going to be very hard for the United States to pivot on some things. If you live in Alberta, if you live in New Brunswick, one of the, where your primary exports are oil or refined oil or crude oil or any of those things, but particularly in Alberta, there is a ready market, and it's a relatively inelastic market. And what I mean by that is that people can't reduce their consumption of petroleum products that easily, right? It's not something you can change in the short run very easily. So for them, I think imports are going to, their situation is relatively strong, at least in the short run. The place that I'm most worried about, to be honest, I mean, we are not as trade exposed as Alberta and not as exposed to the United States as is Alberta or New Brunswick. But Ontario is probably the one I worry about most, and particularly the region that you're sitting in right now, um, is one where which is highly exposed to the auto industry. And the auto industry, the thing that concerns me most is how integrated the auto industry is, right? Is that thanks to, an agreement that existed long before the free trade agreement, the Auto Pact, um, North American, I mean, Canadian and US auto manufacturing industry is highly integrated, right? Parts, components cross the border several times as they go across the border. Things are put in the final assembly. It's almost irrelevant in some ways where the final assembly takes place because so much of the content has been produced in Canada and the United States and crosses the border each time. So imposing tariffs and the first edition of the tariffs that were imposed on March on earlier this week were didn't even have carve outs for any tariffs that subsequently re-export, any goods that you suddenly subsequently re-export back into the United States. So it was potentially devastating. I think it for me it seemed that there is just no way for automakers who rely on this Canada-United States relationship to absorb that cost. And Mexico too, right? A lot of jobs have, a lot of automobile manufacturing, component manufacturing, and final assembly takes place in Mexico. Um,
And to some
it's
extent, I think what we saw is Trump and the US government recognize this fact and pull
Yeah,
back those tariffs the day
pull
after
back.
they implemented them. But they keep, as we talked about before, they pause them. So it still hangs over everyone's head. So if
So
you're
now it's April the 2nd, right? Like that's going to be the
right,
day. And
you're not
my
a
understanding is
worker
he's paused
or
all Mexican tariffs until April 2nd.
that's what this was just breaking before we got on this call. But yeah, that's right. It sounds like Mexico's out from under the tariffs again momentarily. But
Yeah.
if you're Canadian, if you're an auto worker in manufacturing or you're a banker or anybody really who's has some this your livelihood depends on what happens in Canada and the Canadian economy. So how should you be thinking about this right now? I mean, is it just a case of keep your powder dry and maybe don't make any big decisions for a few months or
I think that has to be the case. Like you don't really want to make any decisions about, you certainly don't, I mean, I can't see them making any new investments in an area where, frankly, investments are needed. I mean, we know that manufacturing investment, private sector investment has been lagging in this country. So that was kind of the next, that should have been the focus, right? Is in how to get in private sector investment in. In the short run, I mean, it's more about what do you do? They probably will have to be layoffs. How do you keep the workforce? How do you perhaps not have human capital deterioration? Basically, people losing their skills because they're on layoff a long period of time. All of these things are things that they would have to, you have to be concerned about. But we've already seen these effects, right? I mean, I read about Stellantis pausing their plans for the Chrysler plant, for the Brampton plant, and where I think there's lots of uncertainty not only about electric vehicles, which is what they wanted to produce there, but also about how is this relationship going to look. But I mean, the big three automakers are particularly integrated across the Canada-US border and increasingly over Mexico. And I can't see an easy way in which North American automobile production, if those companies survive at all, or whether their North American automobile production survives as a result of this. I think other companies are implicated, but they also source from areas which are not affected by the tariff and have different business models, so they may be able to adapt a little bit better.
yeah, if you look at kind of size of industries, that does seem to be the one that's at immediate risk.
Yeah,
And it's one of those things we don't really know for sure, but I mean, there were some in the auto industry saying, look, if this goes ahead, we might be shut down in a week or two, not just in
yeah,
Canada, but in the US as well. Like if we're too integrated for that to happen.
Yeah, and I don't know how that plays in a swing state like Michigan or Wisconsin, right? Both of
Right.
whom have large auto production methods. But I mean, this seems. I mean, you hate to say they just seem to be making it up as they go along, but this is definitely seems to be the case, right? That
Well,
oh
it
well,
certainly
we'll do
is.
this. No, we're definitely doing it, and then oh no, wait, we'll have this exception now.
Yeah, it is very hard to understand kind of what is the strategy or intent behind this and what you want. I mean, it clearly isn't reducing fentanyl that's crossing from Canada into the US. So, what is driving it? It's hard to say. Okay, so we're almost at the end of our time. Any concluding thoughts for our listeners on what how we should be thinking about what's going on right now?
I I mean, I think from a policy perspective, the one thing that we need to do is think very carefully about where strategic investments are going. So if you're government, where are you directing or trying to direct investment? And I do think that there has to be some emphasis on moving out of the traditional markets and thinking about new markets, and whether that is exploitation of our mineral strengths. I think that's part of it, but I also do think that there has to be some emphasis on thinking about where the new manufacturing opportunities exist, because we do have a manufacturing base has shrunk, but it is still a vibrant, highly productive workforce, and we don't necessarily want to lose that capacity. So I think that's part of it. The other part, I think, from a policy perspective, is what do we do about the people who are going to be affected dramatically as a result of this? Like if these tariffs do go ahead and we do see shutdowns in the auto sector, for example, there are a variety of innovative plans being talked about, including things like job sharing, where people won't necessarily be laid off, but the government will top up people's earnings to some extent so that two people can do the job of one. I think we need to think about all of that. We need to think about what retraining relief looks like and what kind of retraining programs we want to aim at. There are lots of ideas out there. I think there are lots of people who work on labor markets who know more about this than I do, and some of them work in our but also what this relief is going to look like. I mean, there's a divergence already appearing, I think, on the federal stage between the Liberals and the NDP and probably the Bloc Québécois on one hand, who I think want to take this tariff revenue to support the workers in some way through some sort of enhanced EI scheme and a variety of these other things, retraining programs, etc. And the Conservatives who want to offer tax cuts. I think that's a national conversation that's worth having. I know which side I fall on, but I won't reveal that here because this is not about politics. But it's not about politics. But I think we need to have that conversation. We really do need to think seriously because, I think if Trump had just been elected once, we could say that this was just a passing phenomenon and we will return in 4 years and everything will go back. And I don't know, they may well yet, it may well yet, but this is the third election that he's been through where he's come, I mean, he's won two of them and he came relatively close the last time, right? This is something that's part, I think, of the American political landscape. And if you look at the long arc of history, the United States has been more isolationist than it has been integrationist. And maybe this is something that is part of their DNA and that we need to think carefully about how much we integrate with them, reintegrate or integrate with them versus the rest of the world.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, I think if nothing else, we probably should take this as a bit of a opportunity or maybe even a wake-up call to rethink the way that we manage trade and the way we think about our global partners. And maybe we got a little bit too comfortable
Oh, I think we
as
did.
such a monster and beneficial trading partner right
Yeah.
next door. And so, yeah, in that sense, we can probably all start to think a little more, whether it's the buy Canadian at the consumer level or finding new trading partners at the national level. We could probably revisit some of these things.
Yeah. And, I, I'm still, I think, at my core, a person who thinks that trading with people is a good thing, and that we should be trading more. And so my view um, is that we should be reaching globally. But I also, in some ways, recognize it's funny because I think that there was a group of people who had how it expressed deep skepticism about free trade, and that was tied in with a lot of ideas about loss of sovereignty and loss of independence. And in some ways, a lot of those people have been vindicated. Even, I think they sort of voices disappeared from the Canadian political scene for a long time and from the Canadian academic scene. In some ways, if you go back and read a lot of that stuff, it does seem to resonate in this particular moment that
Interesting. Yeah,
they
it's a sort of a risk
predicted.
we decided to take, and maybe
Yeah,
not. Risk is two-sided. There's a downside, and
there
it
is a
comes back to
downside.
bite us a little bit. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Azim. I
Thank
appreciate
you, Kyle. I hope this has been helpful, and I thank you for the opportunity. This has been tons of fun to talk about
absolutely.
trade.
And yeah, I think we covered a lot in a short period of time. And who knows, at the way, the pace things are changing, we might be back in a couple of weeks talking about a totally different scenario. So we'll see how it goes. Thanks again.
Okay, take care.